Hey there and welcome back to another Avatar video. And today I want to delve into what has got to be one of the worst failings in the entire Avatar franchise, aside from the live action movie. One of the biggest examples of wasted potential that I've ever actually seen. And of course, that is the story of Zuko's mum, and how things ended up wrapped up for her arc during Avatar The Last Airbender's tie-in graphic novels. Zuko's mother, Ursa, who was introduced properly during the third season of Avatar The Last Airbender, was always a bit of an enigma. We never really learn all that much about her there. We know from Zuko's dialogue that when he was young, he thought that his family was somewhat happy. And they'd do things like go on trips to Ember Island to relax and see the Ember Island players perform. But that by the time he'd grown into an older child, that happy family life was a distant memory. His father was cold and distant. His grandfather clearly didn't like him much. And his sister was becoming crueler and more unhinged as she grew older. His only saving grace being his mother, his uncle, and likely his cousin Luten, who would eventually get killed during the siege of Ba Sing Se. And so, most of her story during this time is just being there for her son, scolding Azula for her cruelty, and trying to get Ozai to treat his son better. And of course, as we see, all of this culminates in her offering to murder her father-in-law after he tells Ozai to kill Zuko, all just to punish Ozai for suggesting that Iroh should be replaced as heir by Ozai, as Luten's death had ensured that that line of the Fire family was going to end. And so therefore, Ozai's descendants would just end up ruling anyway. Why not cut out the middleman? And yeah, then crazy old granddad decides that killing off his other grandson's going to be a great idea. And so really, Ursa has no choice but to exchange his life so that Ozai will spare Zuko. And more than that, Ozai then tells her that she has to leave the castle forever for parts unknown, with only a fleeting goodbye to her children. Years would then pass, and we arrive at the current year, the present. And Zuko and Azula have grown into teenagers, with Ursa's absence playing a pretty large part in their respective arcs. Ursa's no longer there to be a buffer between Ozai and Zuko, and eventually, Zuko gets scarred and banished, and meanwhile, Azula never has the chance to come to terms with her strained relationship with her mum. And in her absence, she's decided that she thought that she must have hated her, thought she was a monster. And this ends up playing a fairly massive role in her future mental breakdown at the end of the main series. And that's where we leave off with her story. Zuko and Azula never actually learn where their mother went, and Ozai is pretty tight-lipped on the subject. It was clearly being set up as a great mystery that Zuko would need to solve, likely with Aang's help, as after all, she, and therefore Zuko and Azula, are descended from Avatar Roku. And so, from a certain point of view, they're descended from Aang. And this would certainly have added a bit of a humorous element for Aang to go on a journey with his pseudo-great-grandson to find his granddaughter. I mean, certainly feels like something that he'd joke about, or at least Sokka would. And maybe Azula would have been brought into the mix somewhere here as well. After all, she also had clearly unfinished business with her mum as well. And this journey, this search, it feels like something that they could have made a spin-off show about. Probably, only a single season's worth, but still it would have worked. And yet it never comes about. There was never a show at all, and instead, years later, there was a graphic novel series, The Search. That was released, and I'll be honest, I kind of think The Search is utter garbage, and it really makes the original content that we see in the show look worse. There are just a lot of changes and additions that rub me the wrong way, and that in my eyes don't help the story flow in the most efficient way possible. Things that feel out of character, or simply changes that don't add to the story but detract from it. And this is right from the get-go. And I guess we'll just start off with this. Graphic novel, really? You're going to put one of the biggest hanging plot threads from the original series into a graphic novel trilogy. Just really isn't the same. It had such potential. And then they go and do this? Hell, I bet they regret it now that they're making the films that are following the original characters. Because this would have been first on my list of things to see. It just feels so obvious. Such a massive waste. Ugh. But that's not even what bothers me most here. I think in general, it's just her backstory. The backstory they unleash in this comic very much changes the tone of the show in a way that hurts the arcs of a number of the main Fire Nation royal family members. Long story short, we learn that despite being the descendant of Avatar Roku, they're borderline peasants and Ursa grew up in obscurity. She's a professional actress in a troupe. She has a fiancé, but she has to give all that up to go and live in the Fire Palace as the bride of Prince Ozai. Because reasons. So basically, she's coerced into the marriage, she has 2 rape babies and a miserable existence, and never, not once, had a positive relationship with her husband, which, well yeah, sucks for her. It makes you feel like shit. And I think in the end, it does kind of lessen the impact of Zuko's memories and arc where he breaks away from his family. Because remember, in season 3 he states that he and his family did used to be happy at one point in time, or at least he thought so. He thought that his parents did care for each other. And thus, him abandoning all of that, it means something, and it's more powerful than Ozai just being the worst the entire time, and the family always being dysfunctional. Because it allows the audience to build up an image of what Zuko's early life was, what it was actually like. And then you can contrast that with what we see in the show and the family dynamics that are presented to us. The idea that Ozai was originally a doting father and a loving husband, it's actually quite compelling and interesting. And it adds a lot of depth to a character who's otherwise a very shallow, two-dimensional, mustache-twirling villain. And on top of that, I also think it lessens the tragedy of Azula and Zuko. Because with a father who was always that terrible, who was always going to treat them badly, and a family life that was horrific, what else was going to happen? For me, it's more moving if there's a gradual decline. That you start off with the happiness and well-adjusted children, and over time, the abuse gets to them and they start to change. And that in turn kickstarts their arc. But of course, that's not the only element that I feel like was badly handled. The second major story point that I really hated from the comic was the whole identity change thing. In the story, Ursa decides that she needs to change her face to protect herself, which, is fair enough. And not only that, she decides she wants to wipe away the memories of her past life. She'd no longer remember her time in the Fire Palace, no longer remember her children, her marriage, her family, anything to do with the life she lived as Ursa. And I don't know, but this feels kind of extreme and very selfish and cruel and borderline out of character. Like her whole arc in the show is on one hand being willing to do anything to keep her children safe, even if that means assassinating the Firelord and then leaving her children forever to keep them safe. And then on the other hand, her role in the story is to act as the manifestation of Azula's pain, her grief. Azula is tormented by visions of her mother, whom she believes hated her and considered her a monster. In the show, it sets it up to feel like, Azula's wrong. But the comic, I don't know, it kind of made me think she might have been right in this assumption, because, yeah, she literally wipes her from her memory, and they never really have a relationship beyond that ever again. It's just fully antagonistic. It just didn't play out how I was expecting it to play out. There's so much more potential for Ursa to have had another daughter, and for Azula to feel rejected and replaced, unloved, hated. And thus, the arc is Ursa trying to prove to her daughter that no, I'm your mum and I love you just the same. And they fix things. Fix things somewhat, because Azula still has all of that Ozai treatment to deal with. But instead, she learns that her mum outright chooses to forget her, and then has a third kid in the meantime. A second daughter. And then, that kid is pretty much integrated into the family, and actively replaces Azula in it. Ouch! I don't know, I just feel like from the glimpses that we saw of her in the show, the character of Ursa wouldn't willingly choose to forget her children, and by doing so, it kind of makes Azula's beliefs about her feel legitimate, as opposed to delusions brought on by extreme abuse by her father. I'm not saying that she needs to be a perfect mother, or even a good mother, but I don't know, I feel like the crux of the issue here should have been about Ozai's abuse, and how that causes rifts in the family. Whereas Ursa actively choosing to forget about them feels like the kind of proof that Azula would need to show that yes, my mum never loved me, and therefore, it would no longer make sense for her to ever reconcile. And maybe that's the idea, that not everybody gets their happy ending, their redemption, their reconciliation, but at the same time, I feel like it goes against what we saw in Book 3 of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And we're almost at the end, but I still have yet another complaint. And that's that Ursa sends a fake letter that suggests that Ozai is not Zuko's biological father, which in turn is the root of the hatred that Ozai has for Zuko. He chooses to hate him, even knowing that he is actually his father, just to punish Ursa, which, I don't know, it adds some depth to Ursa, but it also gives Ozai a reason, and yes, it's a flimsy reason, but it's still a reason nonetheless, to hate his son. Whereas I think it's more powerful if he simply comes to hate him on his own, because he's a piece of shit. And he becomes abusive for no reason because he's a piece of shit. The family, they're crazy. They're genocidal maniacs. And I don't like the narrative that there needs to be any sort of explanation behind any sort of domestic violence whatsoever. But here we are. So yeah, I hate the search. I truly, deeply hate the search. And I think Ursa's arc was bungled and wrecked. And by doing so, it did damage Azula's arc. Zuko a little bit, but not really. Mostly Azula. and she really just could have been taken in a much more interesting direction. Hell, I mean, it only needs minor tweaking. There's just a few things that I disagree with, and that in my eyes do tarnish the tale of the royal family somewhat. And in a lot of ways, they just straight up turn the story of this family into trauma porn. And, I don't much care for trauma porn, if I'm being honest. So yeah, didn't like the narrative much, and on top of that, it deserved to be an animated adaptation, not a fucking comic. Oh, the comics! Can't believe this. Whatever. And I mean, it's the same with the founding of Republic City. I mean, what's going on here? Goddamn comic books. But anyway, with all that being said, that's the end of the video, and I would just like to remind you that these have been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of Ursa's arc throughout the comics? Do you like it? Hate it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.